In the heart of ancient Rome, a society steeped in myth, legend, and religious devotion, there existed a group of women whose duties were far more sacred than anyone could imagine. These women, the Vestal Virgins, held a position of extraordinary importance. They were not just priests, they were the very guardians of Rome's survival, entrusted with the task of protecting the city's most sacred fire, a symbol of the Roman Empire's strength and eternal life. But their devotion came with an unimaginable price, a vow of chastity, a vow that, if broken, would result in a fate more terrifying than death itself. The Vestal Virgins were chosen as young girls, typically between the ages of 6 and 10, selected for their purity, beauty, and noble birth. They entered the service of Vesta, the Roman goddess of hearth and home, and swore an oath of chastity, committing to serve in the temple for 30 years. For this sacred role, they received privileges and respect that no other women in Rome could ever hope to achieve. They were granted land, power, and the freedom to move in public spaces, rare for women in an era that confined most to their homes. But along with these privileges came the most sacred of duties, maintaining the eternal fire of Vesta, a flame that symbolized the well-being and prosperity of the Roman state. The fire was not just a flame. It was the lifeblood of Rome. The Romans believed that as long as the fire burned, the city would remain invincible, prosperous, and free from the threat of its enemies. The Vestal Virgins were sworn to protect it day and night. Their vows were not taken lightly. If the fire ever went out, it was considered a dire omen, signaling potential destruction for the empire. But there was another aspect to their sacred responsibility, one that made their vows of chastity even more critical to their role in Roman society. The Vestal Virgins were the embodiment of Rome's purity and strength. Their chastity wasn't just a moral vow, it was the very foundation of the city's divine protection. If a Vestal Virgin was found to have broken her vow of celibacy, the consequences would be catastrophic. The punishment for this breach of trust was one of the most gruesome and fearsome punishments in Roman society, one that would haunt anyone who dared to contemplate breaking such a sacred vow. These women were revered, yet feared, for their power and their sacred bond with the divine. The Vestal Virgins symbolized purity, sacrifice, and devotion, but also the unyielding control of Rome's gods over its citizens. For the Romans, the gods' favor was essential to the empire's strength, and maintaining that favor meant abiding by the most rigid of codes, a code that required ultimate sacrifice for those chosen to serve. But what would happen if one of these women failed in her sacred duty? If she violated her vow of chastity and broke the very trust that the gods had placed in her? The answer, as history reveals, is a chilling and dark secret from Rome's past, a secret that reveals the true price of loyalty to the empire and its gods. In the next part of this story, we will explore the terrifying fate that awaited any Vestal Virgin who dared to break her vow, a fate that would leave an indelible mark on the legacy of ancient Rome. The fate of the Vestal Virgins who broke their vow of chastity was one of Rome's darkest and most haunting secrets. While these women were highly respected and honored, their sacred role also carried with it a terrifying consequence for any who betrayed their vows. To break the sacred vow was considered a betrayal not just of Rome, but of the gods themselves, and the punishment for this betrayal was as brutal as it was final. The penalty? Being buried alive. Roman law dictated that a Vestal Virgin who was found guilty of violating her vow would be condemned to die in the most horrific manner imaginable. There was no trial, no plea for mercy. The gods had been dishonored, and the consequences were final. The unfortunate Vestal Virgin who broke her vow would be led through the streets of Rome in a public procession, a symbol of shame for her and a reminder of the divine wrath that could befall anyone who failed in their sacred duties. The punishment was a macabre ritual that seemed to defy all reason. Once condemned, the woman would be stripped of her sacred vestments, symbols of her purity and divine connection, and led to a chamber beneath the city where her final moments would be spent. Here, the Roman authorities would seal her in a small underground tomb, effectively entombing her alive. There, in total darkness, she would face her final breath alone. Cut off from the world she had once served with the utmost devotion, the burial process was chilling in its symbolism. The woman was placed in a tomb that symbolized both death and dishonor, a fate worse than execution. The act of being buried alive was not just a punishment for her actions. It was a cleansing ritual for the gods. By burying her beneath the earth, the Romans believed they were purging the sin and restoring balance to their sacred duties. The gods, angry and unforgiving, would be appeased by the death of the woman who had broken her sacred vow. What is perhaps most haunting about this punishment was the ritualistic nature of the burial. The Vestal Virgin was not just punished. She was sacrificed for the greater good of the empire. The Romans believed that her death was necessary to maintain divine favor and ensure the continued prosperity of the state. Her life, once dedicated to the gods, would now be taken as an offering to restore the balance and avert disaster. The gods would be satisfied, but at a terrible cost. But why such an extreme measure? Why bury a woman alive for breaking a vow of chastity? To understand this, we must look deeper into the Roman worldview. Rome was a city built on religious devotion, where the gods were seen as the ultimate authority. The Vestal Virgins, as the keepers of the sacred fire, were not just women, they were intermediaries between the gods and the people. Their chastity was not merely a personal matter. It was a divine contract. The fire they tended to was sacred, and its continuance was directly linked to the empire's survival. If the fire went out or if a Vestal Virgin failed in her sacred duty, it was believed to bring misfortune and divine retribution. The penalty of death by burial alive was meant to show the severity of such a betrayal. The punishment also served as a powerful deterrent. It reminded all the Vestal Virgins of the extreme consequences of failing their sacred duties. The Roman Empire thrived on the principle of law and order, and the Vestal Virgins were among the most important enforcers of these divine laws. The gruesome execution of those who broke their vows was a stark reminder to the rest of society that there was no escape from the gods' wrath, no mercy for those who defied their sacred trust. This dark secret about the Vestal Virgins reveals not just the severity of Roman religious practices, but the lengths to which the empire was willing to go to ensure its survival. The Romans believed that every aspect of life, from politics to personal conduct, was under the scrutiny of the gods, and the Vestal Virgins were the protectors of that divine order. Their sacred vow was not just a personal commitment, it was a contract that upheld the very essence of Roman power. However, the stories of these women have remained shrouded in mystery and fear, with many of their names lost to history. The punishment of being buried alive for breaking a vow may seem unimaginable to us today, but to the ancient Romans, it was an act of necessary justice. It was a final sacrifice to maintain the favor of the gods and preserve the empire's prosperity. The legacy of the Vestal Virgins and the harsh punishment meted out to those who faltered in their sacred duties is a stark reminder of the power the ancient Romans attributed to religion and the lengths to which they would go to protect their empire. The story of the Vestal Virgins and their vow of chastity, along with the horrific punishment for betrayal, serves as a haunting glimpse into Rome's deeply religious society, a society that valued divine favor above all else. Their devotion and sacrifice, while often forgotten, remain an eerie testament to the dark and unyielding power that the gods held over the lives of Roman citizens.